Good morning, everybody. Good morning, everybody. So, in disaster management, today we are going to try to understand what is disaster management, and disaster management framework of India. Disaster management, as per Disaster Management Act, disaster means it is a continuous integrated process of planning, organizing, coordinating, and implementing measures. So, understanding a disaster, we need to first of all take up the various definitions, various organizations and institutions who have tried to explain disaster. So, Oxford Dictionary defines disaster as a sudden accident or a natural catastrophe that cause great damage or loss of life. A disaster is an event that or a series of event. It is a basically disaster is an event or a series of event which gives rise to casualties and damages or loss of property, infrastructure, environment, essential services, or means of livelihood on such a scale which is beyond the normal capacity of the affected community to cope with. Okay, so it explains that disaster is an event, is a singular event. It can be a series of event which gives rise to mass casualties and large amount of damages and losses of property, infrastructure, and environment, and also disruption to essential services and livelihood, the means of earnings, on such a scale that it is beyond the ability or capacity of the people of the affected area or the community of the affected area to cope up with it. So they require an external assistance. So, disaster is also sometimes described as a catastrophic situations in which normal pattern of life ecosystem has been disrupted and extraordinary emergency interventions are required to save as per save preserve life or the environment on a larger scale, right? So, when we are talking about environment, we need to understand it is a catastrophe of a big event. So, when it is a larger catastrophe, whether it is cyclone, earthquake, or volcanic eruption, or landslides, or tsunami, or even heat waves and cold waves, the climate change, they all are under the category of disaster. This is these we have mentioned this as a natural hazards which is existing. Then we have man-made disasters also, like uh, technological failure, or you have accidents, industrial accidents, and industrial spills, war. All these are man-made disasters. And sometimes disaster also infuse in such a way that even natural hazard, but due to human intervention, human or anthropogenic activities, it is enhanced to a larger scale, or the intensity increases, or the frequency also increases of the natural disasters. All right, like for example, if I say uh, dam failure. Dam failure all by itself can sound like a man-made disaster, but if you see, it will result into flood, a flash flood on the lower flow of the rivers. So on it is, the flooding areas are already existing. So when a dam breaks, it can cause a catastrophic event, a flood, which can be categorized in natural disaster, but due to the failure of the dam, it is a man-made, categorized into man-made. Similarly, floods in areas which have encroached into the riverbeds are because of human interventions into the natural phenomena, right? Similarly, in a urban flooding is also because of that. uh, then we have tsunamis. The intensities of tsunami is a natural hazard and cause a lot of damages. But if you are not having your residential areas or settlements by the coastal lines, you will not be at the harm's way. So that's why disaster is always whenever how close you are towards the event of that natural catastrophe. Okay. So, defines disaster as occurrence of sudden or major misfortune which disrupts the basic fabric on normal functioning of the society or a community. Okay. So disaster is an event of natural or man-made that leads to sudden disruption of normal life of a society, causing damage to life and property to such an extent that normal social economic value available are inadequate to restore normalcy after a disaster. So, disaster may be defined as a catastrophic situation in which the normal pattern of life have been disrupted. The extraordinary emergency event are required to save and preserve human lives and environment. A disaster is a sudden calamitous event that serious disruption that seriously disrupt the functioning of community, society, and cause human material and economic or environmental losses that exceed the community or society ability to cope with its own resources. So though the often caused by natural disaster can be human origin, like it is as per defined as the United Nation ISDR. As per Disaster Management Act, a disaster can be a catastrophe, mishap, or calamities, right? Or also a accident of a grave occurrences, right? So, how do we measure the measures which are necessary for or expedient for disasters are prevention of danger or threat of any disaster, mitigation or reduction of risk, any disaster or its severity or consequences, capacity building, preparedness to deal with any disaster, prompt or response to any threatening disaster situations or disaster, right, causing the severity or magnitude of effects of any disaster, evacuation, rescue, and relief. So, what we are talking about at first is that prevention of danger. So, first we are talking about prevention, right, or preventing the threat of any disaster. Then we are talking about is mitigation or reduction of risk of any disaster or its severity or consequences. So when we are talking about mitigation or reduction of risk, if we are talking about in case the disaster hits with a very intense severity or whatever the severity level is, whatever the consequence of that disaster being happening in that time should be not of a very alarming losses, or to curtail, to minimize the losses is what we are talking about in mitigation. That means reducing the risk or elements at risk. What are the elements at risk? Your structures can be at elements at risk, or your community or demographic features can be elements at risk, or your settlements or type of pattern of settlement will be the elements at risk or the vulnerability that will contribute to further more losses. So to mitigate, you have to curtail all those things. Now capacity building is preparedness to deal with any disaster. That means when capacity, we are building up a capacity, we need to inculcate prevention and mitigation all together. Only then the capacity of the community will be increased, right? Like how do we increase our capacity to deal with any disaster or any extreme event or an event that has an ability to cause damage or threat our life? can be prevented. First of all, first we'll try to prevent it, prevent the threat that is going to happen. Then if in case we are not able to prevent the event from being happening, like we cannot prevent earthquakes from not coming at all in those areas which are earthquake prone areas, will receive earthquakes sometime or another, where you can do is, like, you can reduce the danger, like you can stop building high rise, you can prevent yourself from building high rise build structures. You can have a disaster, earthquake resistant buildings and material being used, retrofit the old structures to as per the earthquake resistant norms, right, building norms. To mitigate is that you can you can understand what are the vulnerable areas, what are the loopholes, and while finding out the loopholes of vulnerable areas, vulnerable assessment, we can reduce the vulnerability factors. Like if demography is one of the factor of vulnerability, you can in a community, the women and children population is more, where they are more prone to because physically they may be weak, they may be weak as compared to awareness programs. So what you can do is building up their capacity by making them aware, giving them training, giving them drills, and with the practice of training and drills and knowledge imparted regarding the various disasters which is there, can build up their capacity. So preparedness to deal with any disaster is what building up the capacity altogether, along with prevention activities and mitigation. Then promotion of response of any threatening disaster situation or disaster, right? Okay. So uh, prompt response to any threatening disaster situation or disaster can be very helpful in reducing the losses. Similarly, assessing the severity or magnitude of effects of any disaster, evacuation and rescue and relief will also be a very important part of reducing the losses. Rehabilitation and reconstruction is also a part of where the losses, where you are picking up your losses and rehabilitating and trying to get back to the normalcy. So disaster management can be defined as the organization and management of resources and responsibility for dealing with all humanitarian aspects of emergencies, in particular preparedness, response, and recovery, in order to lessen the impact of disaster. Right now, disaster management includes 7 administrative decisions and operational activities that involves prevention, mitigation, response. Um, uh, Prevention, mitigation, preparedness, response, recovery, and rehabilitation. So we will take one by one all these points. So disaster management involving all level of government and non-government community-based organization, playing a vital role in processing and the modern disaster management that is going beyond the post-disaster assistant. It is more like a proactive activities for dealing with disaster. So it includes pre-disaster planning and preparedness activities, organizational planning, training, information management, public relations, and many other fields related to it. So, crisis management is important, but it is only a part of a responsibility of a disaster management. So, the newer paradigm is that the total risk management is which takes the holistic approach of risk reduction. So how we are going to take a holistic approach of risk reduction is that we have to inculcate not only the post disaster losses, but preparing it beforehand. So planning, organizing, training, in information dissemination management, and in how we are going to do that, public relations, how we are going to develop a public relation and community relations, and other fields that are essential service givers during the management. So a crisis management being important part, it also has to inculcate total risk management as a total risk approaches. So let's understand the concept altogether. That is, first concept we come across in disaster is that hazard. So hazards are those elements of physical environment harm to man that can harm to man and cause by force of extraneous to a person. So Buton explains that it as an element of physical environment that can cause harm to mankind. So, standards of Australia defines hazard as a source of potential harm or a situation with a potential to cause losses. So, standards of Australia defines this hazard as a more clear manner. It is the source of potential harm. So, a source which can cause harm to life and property, or a situation which has a can threaten a life and property is what hazard is. So, a natural event that has a potential to cause harm or losses are hazards. So, it is a threat of causing a damage. So, a future source of danger, or it is a potential to cause harm of human health and and property and activities, or environmental losses are part of hazards. So, some examples of hazards are earthquake, volcanic eruptions, cyclones, floods, landslides, and other such events. Now, let's see how they are not disaster but a hazard at first. So, when we do not have, you know, when there is an earthquake and it is an open ground and there is no structure, no people to cause any damage, it will only be a hazard. That in case if there is a man or there is a structure there, it could have collapsed, it could have caused losses of life, right? But just all by itself, in nature, earthquake is not a disaster. It is only a disaster when it causes losses. Okay. Similarly, a volcanic eruption is a natural phenomena. It had been happening in Earth's history for a very prehistorical time. From since that Earth has been existing, the volcanic activities are normal, are natural. And now in recent times, volcanic eruptions are reducing. Earlier, in Jurassic or Terrasic period of time, volcanic eruptions were more common, right? So but if you see it at this time, you will come with that there are lesser incidences of volcanic eruptions comparatively. So human being, when they are settled on the base of the volcano, and the ashes and the lavas, when they destroy their houses, their properties, they threaten their life, and anything that they own, is a disaster, until unless it is just a natural hazard. Similarly, cyclone is also a natural phenomena. It had been arising from the ocean to the coastal areas, but until unless it is not damaging any environment, or it is not damaging any human property, life, or whatever anthropogenic losses, it is not a disaster. It is just a natural phenomenon, right? Similarly, flooding is a natural way of rivers. They keep flooding, and that is flood has a very positive effect of reviving and recharging the soil quality. So flood is very beneficial if you see, but it becomes a disaster when you have an agricultural field and that gets flooded, all right, that gets inundated due to river flood. or you have a structure build up on a in a such a area where the drainage is getting blocked, and your house is getting inundated because of the rising water, is a disaster, right? So until unless we don't have anything to lose, it is not a disaster, it is a hazard. So that means anything, any element which can cause a physical damage of can cause, not had cause. So there's a difference. May cause, right? So landslide is also landslides happening in a area which is just a abandoned or a barren land will not cause damages to human life. It's not a disaster, it is a hazard. So had it been there, had there had been any structures there, it could have been turned into a disaster. So such events, when they exist in nature and does not threaten human life, it is just a hazard. When it threatens a human life, it is a disaster. So, environmental events become hazard once they threaten to affect society or environment in an adverse manner. So, a physical event such as volcanic eruption that does not affect human being is a natural phenomena, but not a natural. It is a natural hazard. A natural phenomena that occurs in a populated area is a hazardous event. So hazardous event that causes unacceptable large number of fatality or overwhelming property damage is a natural disaster. So in areas where there are no human interest, natural phenomena do not constitute to hazard, nor do they result into disaster. Okay. So like important characteristics of to analyze hazard is that since only occurrence exceeding some defined level of magnitude are considered hazardous, it may vary from place to place and community to community, other than demographic factors like magnitude of hazards, frequency of hazard, intensity of impact. Just hold on 1 minute. Okay. So, coming to what are the important characteristics of analysis of hazard, it is like magnitude of hazard, like how strongly it is affecting those areas. Then frequency, how often it is visiting that particular area. Okay, so magnitude is how, what is the force of the disaster that is hitting, or the hazard that is hitting that area. Like, cyclone intensity, right? Earthquake rector scale in very high, being a magnitude. Frequency is how often it is coming, like every season, every quarterly, or very often, like twice in a year, thrice in a year. That is the frequency, how often it is coming, occurrence. And then intensity of the impact. Now, impact of intensity is based on what are the things that we that are getting at danger, at harm's length, is the intensity of impact. Like how many people are going to die, how many people are being vulnerable to those uh, you know uh, hazard or disaster, right? That is the intensity at the impact point. Okay. The secondary hazards are the that uh, can be listed as falling off, when any disaster happens, and because of that, the it triggers furthermore activities, like when earthquake happens. Earthquake is just shaking of earth. So if you have a structure, a strong structure standing there, only your building is shaken up, that is not furthermore causing, it may make you topple off, but it will not cause any damage. But if the building base is weak, and there's an earthquake which has come up, the collapse of the building is a secondary hazard. So dam failure, fire accidents, hazardous material spilled, interruption of power, water supply, communication, transportation, and waste disposal are all part of secondary hazards. Like solid liquefaction. Then you have tsunamis triggered because of earthquake. Water pollution triggered because of flooding. They are all part of secondary hazards. Risk management standards define risk as a chance of something happening that will have an impact upon objectives. So it is measured in terms of consequences and likelihood. So risk means expected number of life lost, person injured, and damage to property, and disruption of economic activity due to natural phenomena, and consequently the product of specific risk and element at risk, right? The probability that community structure or geographic areas to be damaged or disrupted by the impact of a particular hazard, or account of their nature, destruction, and proximity to a hazardous area. So risk is a function of threat exploiting vulnerability to obtain damage or destroy asset. So thus threat is or may exist, but if there is no vulnerability, then there is a little or no risk at all. The key concept of risk is that when hazard is mixed with a vulnerability, and the capacity is low, it directly directs you to the disaster risk. So a risk is what, when there is an existing hazard, when there is an existing vulnerability, and the capacity, depending on how what is the capacity of you to withstand that hazard, is that it gives you a total direct ratio of disaster risk, right? So disaster risk is hazard, exposure, vulnerability, and capacity measures, right? So probability, severity, hazard is like what is the probability that it can come, and what is the severity it can hit with. Okay. Exposure is that structure and population and economy which is in face with the hazard is exposure. How close or how vulnerable the structure is, how, what are the what is the number of population which is exposed to the hazard are there, and what are the economic losses that is going to come up with the hazard impact is what exposure is. Vulnerability is the physical, social, and economic, environmental matters. So that is, physical vulnerability can be there. There can be social vulnerability and economic vulnerability. Also environmental vulnerability. Then you have capacity and measures. That is physical planning, social capacity, economic capacity management are all part of physical planning and social capacity and economic management. So hazard trends and prediction of drought and flood, sea level rise, heat wave precipitation are all part of hazards which is existing. Adaptive capacity is like, or capacity is information and resources that are available for the people to help themselves to overcome the situation. Institution and government structures that is there to assist them, that is the capacity. Then vulnerability is the size and the density of topography, and then population, demographic pattern, or demographic combinations, like how many poor, what is the GDP, what is the economic status, and all those things are part of vulnerability, giving rise to disaster risk. Then we come to vulnerability. Vulnerability refers to the inability to withstand the effect of hostile environment. The window of vulnerability is at times a frame within which defensive measures are reduced and compromised or lack. According to UNESCO and UNDRO defines hazard and risk technology. Vulnerability is a degree of loss to given element or set of element at risk resulting from occurrence of hazards, a phenomena of a given magnitude. It is expressed on a scale of from 0 to 1 on a totality, right? Then the concept of vulnerability is that vulnerability is exposure plus resistance plus resilience. Okay, so a vulnerability is how much you expose to, what is the resistance that you are going to give up to the disaster or the hazard, and what is the resilience, how much you can withstand the the hazard, is what your vulnerable level is. Exposure is at risk, is at risk property and population, and a resistance means measure taken to prevent and provide or reduce the losses. Resilience is ability to recover prior state or achieve the desired post disaster states. Vulnerability is the propensity of things to be damaged by the hazard, and vulnerability can be defined in this following pattern, that this is capacity to cope, that high capacity and low capacity. So low and high will give you more very low and exposure also high and low can also pertain to the number of vulnerability that can increase, right? So people of southern southeastern part of West Bengal are more vulnerable to cyclone because of high exposure to cyclone and low resistance to or resilience, because low resistance as a lack of proper management, disaster management, which is even till date, right? So low resilience because the economic limitations of the people who are residing there. So like take a case study of Amphan, or you like just now what has happened in super cyclones, which is coming up in Bay of Bengal in a very frequent manner in past 5 years. In past 5 years, if you see, Bay of Bengal is having consecutively super cyclone coming in every year, like in past years, like taking from Amphan, Titli to what has happened in recent times. So why it is happening? It is happening because of the rise of the temperature of the ocean water, that is Indian Ocean water. Okay, so we will talk about that, and and further more lecture on cyclone. Let's discuss about the cyclone. Why in recent time the cyclone intensity in India is increasing? Right, we are going to talk about it all together on a different lecture. So the type of sector of vulnerabilities are, four main types of vulnerability. Physical vulnerability, all right, means the potential of physical impact on physical environment which can be exposed to as element at risk. The degree of loss to a given ERA or a set of ERA, that is emergency at risk, resulting from occurrence of natural phenomena or given magnitude and exposure on a scale from 0 to 1. So it may be determined by aspects such as population, remoteness, settlement, site, and many other factors. Economic vulnerability is another there, that what is the buying capacity of the people on residing in the vulnerable or the risk prone areas. Similarly, social vulnerability, like what is the social cognizance, social awareness, community activities, human rights systems, and every part of society is social vulnerabilities. Social prejudices can also be one of the social vulnerabilities. Environmental vulnerability resources depend on source and key vulnerability. Like, wetland, such as maritime sands, water, and pollution, stormwater runoff containing agriculture and chemical eroded soil and right. We have yeah, then we have what is coping capacity. So to understand coping capacity, the ability of the people, organization, and system using available skills and resources to face and manage adverse condition, emergency or disaster. The capacity to you know um, just a minute. Yeah. So the capacity to cope and requires continuous awareness, resources, and good management, both in normal times as well as during crisis or adverse condition. So coping capacity contributes to reduction of disaster risk. Right. So this is all the coping capacity related to vulnerability and risk assessment. Okay. So we are going to, in upcoming classes, we are going to discuss in detail the coping capacity and vulnerability assessment in detail. Okay. So I urge all of you to go to your LMS and take the quiz for today's lecture. Okay. Have a nice day.